Hello and welcome. Today is the Professional Development Equilibrium Community of Practice session for February 7th, 2023. And we are going to be talking today about BANI versus VUCA and what that means to equilibrium practitioners. And so this picture kind of gives us that feel, that whole idea that a picture's worth a thousand words, right? That constant motion is something that we can all relate to in the world that we live in. So what in the world is VUCA? Some of you may be familiar with this acronym. It describes the various dimensions of the uncontrollable environment in which we live. This was adopted by business use for the business world in around 2009, 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. Um, it was coined before that, but it really wasn't used in terms of leadership development, organizational development, and the implications to organizations until that time. Around the same time frame, you may have seen some of those videos that were coming out every couple of years. There, it was called the Did You Know series, and just a lot of those crazy facts, statistics around the rapid change in our world and how mind-boggling some of those facts are. So that was around the same era. What does that acronym stand for? Well, the V is for the volatility. U is for uncertainty. C has to do with the complexity, and A, ambiguity. I like the way this diagram sort of lays it out. It gives us a way of viewing this that I find helpful. So on the left side, you can see in an environment where there is low volatility, low uncertainty, low complexity, and low ambiguity, it's much more manageable. We can kind of sail through with much greater ease when that's the case. And if one or two of those things switch over to the high side, we can still feel we have a solid enough footing to manage and navigate. But as we might imagine, with all four of those elements on the high side, it becomes quite unmanageable, or the sensation is that it's just unmanageable, much like the illustration on the right. And so many of us may have even experienced the sensation. Our head is full. It feels like it's going to explode. We can't put one more thing in there. And there's just that sense of feeling somewhat frazzled. The volatility really relates to the speed of change, whether that is in industry, market, the world, or just the speed of change in general. And changes seem to be occurring in a rapid fire succession, or in some cases occurring simultaneously. They tend to be large scale and continuous. So there's never that point of, okay, we've arrived, we can sort of rest on our laurels for a bit. It seems to be just ongoing, continuous motion. And that brings about a lot of instability as well. Uncertainty. When there's high degree of uncertainty, there's a loss of confidence in being able to predict the future. And so it becomes very hard to understand what's going on with increasing uncertainty. It's very hard for leaders to make decisions. So there's that sense of constantly sort of playing Russian roulette, not feeling a great degree of confidence in the decisions, but needing to plow ahead in spite of sound confidence in the future. And so that uncertainty adds another layer of difficulty and challenge for decision makers. Complexity. Just take a look at this screen, and if that doesn't take you back to your days of early college statistics or whatever this is, um, I don't know. For me, I look at that and I think, whoa, whoa, information overload here. Pull out one and you might be able to work through it, break it down. But when you see all of that in its complexity, it's quite overwhelming. So, with greater complexity, there's just too many variables. It becomes really hard to analyze and make rational decisions. Ambiguity. With high ambiguity, there's a lack of clarity about how to interpret things in general. And information is often incomplete, contradictory, or too unreliable to trust conclusions. There's a sense of pervasive vagueness and fuzziness of ideas or arguments. And with the constant 24/7 news cycle and the um, varying reports and the accusations of false news on either side of the aisle, and who do you believe? There's this sense of uh, constant turmoil and lack of clarity and conflicting reports all over the map. That takes us up to about 2020. So the VUCA period, if you will, was roughly 2009 to 2020, and then we experienced this worldwide change yet again. And so, along with that came the notion that, I think we need some new language to describe what's really occurring here. So, while it's not completely doing away with VUCA, there seems to be have been an evolution, and BANI is taking us to a new place. And let's take a look at this acronym. So we've gone from volatile to brittle, from uncertain to now anxious, to complex to nonlinear, while still complex, and then from ambiguous to incomprehensible. So the notion of brittle brings with it that sense of just everything is very fragile. There's a lot of fear around that kind of walking on eggshells and waiting for things to just crash. So that seems quite pervasive, that living in a brittle environment, there is that impending sense of something that, the shoe's going to drop and everything's going to be crushed. Anxious is bringing about a lot of fear and pressure to make decisions. There's no time to be lost on hesitation. Because of that continuous motion, things need to keep moving along at a very quick pace. And there is, along with that, fear and anxiety, escalating mental illness. And this is a whole nother topic, but it tucks right into this, and we can certainly see why those numbers are where they are. I've shared in the past that the projections for the year 2030, unless something is dramatically changed, the projections are that we will be experiencing over $6 trillion annually addressing mental illness challenges. In a non-linear environment, what happens when things are non-linear? Small decisions can have devastating consequences. The effort, at one point, we had more of a direct cause and effect link between effort and results, but in a nonlinear world, that's not necessarily the case. So effort does not necessitate uh, a, a commensurate amount of results, or good results will occur from a lot of effort. So that's gone. The assumption, we can't assume that anymore. Nothing is certain. And so strategic plans must constantly adapt. So agility is needed. Back to the nonlinear, my dear friend and colleague and former fighter pilot shared with me an acronym that he used when he was a fighter pilot. And it really does tie into this the notion that small decisions can have devastating consequences. So the process he went through mentally about that constant observing and being able to make decisions very, very quickly in that non-linear um, uh, a situation and environment as a fighter pilot. That's a very great analogy. I think that helps us to really think of what exactly that's like. So we're all kind of flying around as like fighter pilots would be in this non-linear environment that we now find ourselves in. The incomprehensible, information overload. We can't determine cause and effect necessarily. Change happens so fast, we can't get our arms around it. So, let alone comprehend or make meaning of it. So, there's that sense of just being doused with a fire hose continually with changing, seemingly uh, incomprehensible elements that we're being faced with each and every day, new and changing realities. So look at this screen and think for a moment. Have you ever changed a tire? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But I would venture to say that given the right tools, maybe a YouTube video or a Google it, but you could change a tire. Anybody could change a tire if you had the right tools and you were in the right environment. You could do that, assuming you're an able-bodied person. But what about now? So imagine trying to change the tires on a speeding car zooming down the highway, and conditions aren't great. It's a wet road, looks like as well. So that changes things, right? So that's just a way of thinking about the world we find ourselves in now versus what might have felt familiar in the past. I've also heard it said that sometimes it's just revealing, the world will reveal to us where our false sense of security lies, where our false sense of strength lies. And so the challenges that are being presented to us today, how will we respond? So a BANI world requires a systemic equilibrium lens to respond effectively. If we are to respond effectively, we must look at things with that systemic view of the world we live in. So sometimes I train coaches, I mentor coaches, and a lot of times coaches will tell me they don't work with teams or groups, they only coach individuals. So I would invite you to think about this in a different way. If you are someone who considers yourself to only work with individuals, only coach individuals, I would invite you to think about that individual you may or may be working with now or in the future. And that person, while you might not see all those others in the room, that person is nested within every other system. So, whether that is their work team, whether that's their family, that individual is nested within another system. And so, we must use a systemic approach. And in fact, equilibrium takes that into consideration. When I am working with a client, whether that person is struggling with obstacles at work or getting, moving their team along, getting their direct reports to move ahead and improve performance, whatever the issue might be, it is always a systemic approach. And a lot of times, the individual, when we're working through equilibrium and we're dealing with triggers that result in their own equilibrium being disrupted, well, that's coming from a systemic area. It's not just housed in a vacuum. It's either someone said something that makes them think of something else, and suddenly now they've been triggered, and it reminds them in their subconscious about a bad experience from the past, and now that's presented itself in the present, and it's causing them problems now. That is all systemic, so we don't necessarily use that language, but I wanted to invite you to start thinking that way, that it's all nested within the other systems. And the team then, of course, is a part of a team of teams. The team of teams then make up the larger organization. Then we have our community that the organization is a part of. And somewhere in here, again, I had one of our colleagues had a colleague share the notion of the virtual team. So, where does that fit in? I haven't really given a lot of thought to that just yet, but the notion of virtual teams certainly is a newer reality and has become much, much more prevalent since 2020. And so, since the onset of the BANI world, virtual teams are a part of that new reality. And then ultimately, the larger ecosystem. So, this whole world and all that is in it, there is that systemic nature, and every system is nested within every other system. So that's just something I wanted to encourage you to give some more thought to as we move forward. It is really going to be what the world is demanding of us and what we must step up to provide. Some systemic realities. There's a global interconnectedness. The collective is greater than the sum of its parts. The type of thinking that created the problems in the world cannot be used to solve those same problems. We have to use a different kind of thinking. BANI world demands systemic thinking. Equilibrium practitioners can facilitate the paradigm shift from individualistic to systemic. Again, we are never coaching an individual. Remember, every individual that you might encounter or work with or live with, for that matter, every individual is part of a system. So that moves up the chain from individual to team of teams, organization, community, and the larger ecosystem. Let's talk a little bit about the world through an equilibrium lens, because this really is around how we as equilibrium practitioners are poised to respond effectively to the new realities of the world we find ourselves in. So, the equilibrium framework empowers practitioners to address each one of these elements in that BANI acronym. So, with the brittle aspect, how do we address that? How do we counterbalance that? Well, we want to work on building equilibrium capacity, and this occurs through integration of all six disciplines. So that the integration really is on the spiritual level, that heart, gut, brain integration, but it takes into consideration all of those six disciplines. And so building that overall equilibrium capacity is going to support people experiencing the ramifications of living in a brittle environment. It will build their resilience, it will build their emotional intelligence, and it will build up their resolve and ability to stay in equilibrium in spite of surrounding circumstances. Anxious. How do we respond to the anxious piece? We do that through empathy, mindfulness, and intentional grounding. And I'm not talking about football here. I'm not using a football term. When I'm talking about intentional grounding, that is the spiritual discipline of finding that place of grounding and growing that with intention and building that with intention to strengthen the spiritual discipline and thereby overall strengthening of the integration of all of the six disciplines. So the anxious response is we respond through application of disciplines 1 through 4. Non-linear, we respond to the nonlinear environment through creating systemic context and building acceptance. So the acceptance is a discipline in and of itself. That discipline number 5, the ability to stand firmly in accepting even intolerable circumstances. That's not the same as being complacent or burying one's head in the sand or ignoring it, but being able to stand firm no matter what without being sucked down into the quicksand or pulled into panic mode or disequilibrium. It allows us to stay in equilibrium where we're better equipped to make sound decisions, to be able to act accordingly, to respond effectively, because why? We have not engaged in the amygdala hijack. We've been able to, through practice, discipline ourselves so that we can stay within the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is our executive powers of reason. So that 5th discipline, building acceptance, strengthening acceptance, is the effective response to the nonlinear environment. The incomprehensible, how do we respond through an equilibrium lens? Well, this is through authenticity, building and growing and intentionally expanding authenticity, transparency, and intuition. And also, we want to build our control equilibrium. The control equilibrium is discipline 6. And through growing that and building that with intention, we facilitate staying within equilibrium in face of the incomprehensible. All right, so that takes us through the equilibrium approach and the systemic approach to a BANI world. Here are some resources for you. And so if you would like additional information on any of this, you can please feel free to check out these references. You'll have a copy of the PowerPoint deck for your reference as well. Thanks so much. And that concludes our session today.